Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick Graham.
And I'm Alastair Ball.
And this is episode 5, and after the superhero overdose last time, this fortnight we will be talking about recent cult hit horror movie The Witch, the conclusion of Serial Season 2, the BAFTA-nominated video game Her Story, and we'll be seeing how Alastair found those Punisher comics I recommended him last time. And if you're thinking there's not much moderate fantasy violence in that, then shut up, stop being so mean. Okay, Alastair, outside of your mandated reading for this podcast, what have you been looking at in the last fortnight?
I've been watching a lot of Raised by Wolves recently. The last episode in the second series was on TV last night. It's written by Kayla Moran. I really like her books and I really like her columns, and this sitcom is just hilarious. It's I know you don't get many shows set in my native Midlands.
No, you don't.
It's really this and Peaky Blinders. So yeah, there's some good Midlands-based entertainment, especially like all the references to small towns in the Midlands I'm familiar with.
Yeah, there really aren't many British sitcoms as a whole I'm following, so I should probably check that out. The only British comedy show I'm really watching at the moment is Stuart Lee's Comedy Vehicle that we mentioned last time, and that's obviously not a sitcom, that's a stand-up show.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be like many quality sort of British sitcoms around right now. So Nick, what have you been watching this week?
The last thing I watched was the Series 6 finale of The Walking Dead, which is still a comic adaptation, but at least it's not a superhero one, which was alright. It's generated some controversy on the internet because, without giving away the whole thing for no reason, it did have quite a big, cheap, stop mid-scene cliffhanger, which, considering the whole series, or at least the last half season, has been building up to this moment, to then stop in the middle of it has, I think, made some people feel a bit cheated. And I can kind of see their point. I'm quite enjoying the general tone of it, but the cliffhanger was really, really cheap.
I can certainly see how people would find that really annoying. It is definitely annoying when shows build up to something and then kind of take it away from you at the last minute.
Yeah, and the last episode was a really slow build to this sort of portended ending, and it was an extra long full hour rather than 40-minute episode. So then it finally happened, and then it didn't quite happen. And yeah, anyway, you can read plenty on the internet if you're so inclined about the controversy over The Walking Dead, but yeah, it was a slightly disappointing finale in the end. But yeah, nevertheless, I've enjoyed most of the season, so I'm definitely there for season 7.
First this week we'll be discussing The Witch, a recent horror movie that's been receiving a lot of critical praise and won the Best New Director at last year's BFI London Film Festival. It's the only film I really wanted to see at the film festival last year that I didn't get to see at the festival itself. The tickets sold out really quickly, so I'm really glad I got a chance to see it recently. And it was, I found it certainly pretty scary. I don't know, Nick, what did you think?
It's a very slow burn film. My biggest struggle was, to be honest, being a bit disappointed by the ending, but maybe I should save the ending talk for one block at the end of the segment or something. Overall, it is really atmospheric. The period stuff's really good, and a lot of the horror stuff, especially the stuff prior to the ending, works really, really well. There's some genuinely fucked up shit. In fact, there's a particularly good bit of fucked up shit at the very first few minutes of the movie. It very much put me in a sort of, oh, wow, fucking hell, sort of setup for the rest of it, which, I don't know, may possibly have then laid on false expectations for the rest of it, because the rest of the film was very, very underplayed. I know there's been a lot of talk, because a lot of the creepiness is so underplayed, in some cases so underplayed as to be non-existent, about whether it's all a metaphor or a shared hallucination or all in someone's head, or whether the things that are portrayed on screen really happened as presented. Because a lot of it is very in line with mythology to the extent that someone could have just projected it on themselves. As in the characters, not the director. I'm assuming the director didn't write the script whilst in a haze, imagining witches dancing around him.
It's an issue with this kind of horror movie, which is when, it walks a fine line between, are these events you're seeing real, or are they, like you say, a collective hallucination? And it does a good job of kind of balancing the two. You're never quite certain, if there is a supernatural element to this story, or if it's just people sort of losing it in the wilderness. The only problem with horror movies like that is when it gets to the end, you have to come down one way or the other. You have to give a definitive answer. And usually that definitive answer is a disappointment.
Yeah, but
which was kind of the case with The Witch.
I mean, it gives what's superficially a definitive answer, and again, we're dancing vaguely around actually saying what happens at the end. The thing is, with the exception of the aforementioned fucked up shit interlude in the first few minutes, it is a very down-to-earth, not weird, not fucked up film for the bulk of its runtime. I think after one initial bit at the beginning, there's only one bit maybe of on-screen potentially supernatural until the very end, or at least the last 20 minutes where stuff goes properly mad. And yeah, I think to its credit, even though it's all the underplayed stuff, all the bits with just the characters is really, really good. They're really, they're really committed. The vocabulary's there. The characters are very well defined. I got a fairly good idea of who everyone is.
Yeah.
The acting's all very good. It's very straight-faced. I think a lot of people have been saying this isn't like other horror movies, and it's not like other horror movies in the sense that it's one of the few horror things I've seen recently. Because, like, we were talking about how Welcome to Night Vale does this, like, to a huge degree. Welcome to Night Vale is the extreme version of what I'm trying to talk about. It's the idea of being aware of your genre, or aware that you're alluding to something the audience already knows.
Yeah.
Whereas this is a film that, I don't know how much it's playing on that.
It's certainly different to most horror movies, certainly recent horror movies, in that it's creepy, it's not jumpy. It's like those, I know, dramas that kind of really lay on the kind of the melodrama and the sort of, string music. It's kind of, you just feel at the end of it, you're just being cheaply emotionally manipulated. And I did feel that The Witch was good at kind of really building up a proper atmosphere of creepiness, of tension, not taking any cheap shortcuts, really making me kind of this kind of sustained sense of being frightened. I think part of that's to do with the setting. It's set in sort of New England in sort of the early history of America. It's been compared a lot to Arthur Miller's play The Crucible. I think it's set in a similar time and also is about witches in New England. The main characters, it's not really gone into, but they're very religious. It's a family. Their father has been cast out of their sort of settler community for some form of heresy. He believes that he's just more devout than the rest. They go and start a farm somewhere in the wilderness, and then strange things start to happen, and they're not certain if one of the people in the family is a witch, or maybe a witch lives in the forest nearby. But it is pretty good at sustaining that tension.
And it is doing a story that is quite, in its own way, quite straightforward for a story in this setting. The idea of setting a story during the era where people sincerely believed in witches, and then having the suspicion of being a witch fall upon individuals is quite standard. I mean, as you say, The Crucible being the most well-known example. But it's the sort of thing you expect to see quite a lot in these films. I mean, I think there was an episode of Inside Number 9 on the BBC last year which did roughly the same thing. There was a woman who was unmarried, and it was implied occasionally slept with men, and the community didn't approve of her, so tried to imply that she was a witch. It's very much the standard story, but it's done, as I say, it's done in a very straight way, it doesn't skip over stages or just go, you know how this goes. It's very, we're going to commit to this, we're going to do it dead serious, we're going to have all the dialogue be properly sincere, yelling about religion without any adjustment, I guess, for the modern secular attitude to that sort of thing. It's the sort of thing that if you did that in the street today, you'd get laughed at. And the characters in this film at the screening we were in did indeed get laughed at.
Yeah, it's hard to understand from like a modern perspective. You're definitely right. There's an element that you have to kind of believe in. You have to believe in the past. You have to believe that, people were this paranoid about witches and genuinely believed that they existed. And you do have to kind of suspend your disbelief in sort of the sense that people can be so kind of intense about the idea of someone living in the forest being evil and wanting to prey on them, which can be a bit of a leap. I think that's why we don't get that many historical horror films or historical horror as much, because it's easier to identify with a character in the present day with attitudes similar to ours, and then once you identify with them, you can make that character feel threatened, and the reader or viewer will feel scared. It's harder to get in the head of someone in New England in the sort of 17th or 18th century. Although I do feel that in some ways horror set in the past can be scarier. This past does feel very alien to us, and it does. And also, there's an element of there were different moral codes in the past. Especially if you lived in the wilderness in New England, there's really no sort of apparatus to enforce the laws or what we view as the rules of society. There's nothing to hold human beings in check other than each other. So there really is an element of anything can happen. If these people go mad, there's nothing to stop them killing each other. And if the witch isn't true, it's just their paranoia. There's nothing to stop them burning or a member of their family. And it's entirely the sort of thing that's possible. So I think, the fact that in the past there were different rules, and also you get this sense usually in the past that violence came more easily and it was more likely, that puts you on edge. And I think that's something the film plays into really well.
Sorry, just trying to remember what the first instance of actual violence in the film is.
Well, I guess it's all the implied violence. I felt that the fact that the father, who's the sort of most religious figure, could conceivably murder one of the other members of the family had he become convinced they were a witch. And there's certainly elements of his different daughters of his blaming each other, trying to convince the father that another person's is a witch in order to kind of distract attention from themselves, or at least to not be blamed for the series of sort of misfortunes that has happened to the family.
Yes, whereas, as you say, it's heavily implied at the beginning that the misfortune was fallen on the family is largely his fault, potentially, for displeasing the community they used to be part of.
Yeah.
And it's not gone into at length. There's like a snatch of it at the beginning, but yeah, it sets up the dynamics.
I thought that was well done. It's just enough to get a sense of the story. I mean, yeah, within the first minute or so, you've got them, or the first 5 minutes, you've got them in a field, sort of praying. They've found a big clearing surrounded by forest. They think this is an ideal place to make a home. Then they jump forward in time, and they've got crops that are affected by blight, and their animals aren't producing milk, and things are starting to go badly wrong for them. And obviously, they start to question why and come up with
jump to some conclusions, yeah.
There is a degree of ambiguity there, if you want to interpret it that way.
Yeah, but as always, well, maybe I reached a point soon where I'll just have to snap and start discussing the end. But yeah, there's a degree of ambiguity in a lot of the really weird shit, even the stuff which, at the time, seems like it's been shown fairly straight.
Yeah.
There is a plot set up for the fact that they've all been poisoned by their rotten crops, or
just isolation and loneliness.
Or they've just gone a bit strange, yeah.
I think we've danced around the answer, the ending of the film for a while.
Yeah, you're right. I think we do need to get into the actual ending, just so we can stop dancing around this. And yeah, so if you think you might see the film and don't want to be pretty much told what happens at the end, probably jump forward 5 or 6 minutes. I'm guessing. But yeah, so the ending, basically the goat that's been hanging around for the entire film, well, take it entirely at face value, is on-screen revealed to be Satan, and signs a deal with the daughter, who is the only surviving member of the family, who then runs off into the woods and joins a coven. That's basically
becomes a witch.
And then it levitates a bit, and then the film ends.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, and that's obviously the point when the film has to come down one way or another. Either they've all gone mad, and, it's a series of accidents that's led to the death of the entire family apart from this woman.
Thomasin.
Yeah, Thomasin. Or they have to reveal that there was some supernatural thing at play. And they come down on the side of it genuinely being supernatural. And the problem is, with these kind of, is it real, is it not real, is that usually either way, the ending is disappointing.
Yeah, there is a part of me who was like, if it just sort of faded to black after she'd stabbed her father, and left it vaguely ambiguous, maybe I would have liked that more. But then again, maybe I would have found that really annoying.
I genuinely prefer it when they do say definitively, if there's a mystery at the heart of a film where they give a definitive answer, rather than trying to have their cake and eating it by not telling you, because that can be really annoying, an annoying ending.
Yeah.
It is very difficult to get that ending right.
I think some of it might have been money, to be honest. I get the feeling there may have been an effects limitation in there somewhere.
Well, in some ways, because the fact that they had a low effects budget meant, again, that they, rather than doing kind of a lot of gore, they kind of had a lot of implied horror, which I think worked quite well, and not sort of showing Satan directly, just having his voice and you see his hand. That kind of worked quite well. But then the final scene with the levitating witches did look a little bit daft.
Yeah, a little bit. I think they could have faded away as she was running towards the coven, and that would probably have got their point across without needing to resort to levitation effects.
Yeah, I think if she just sort of signed in the Devil's Book and then walked naked into the forest, that would have been a creepy enough ending. Because, that also could have had at least some degree of ambiguity.
It could still have been her going completely mad. I think that's what a lot of people have said. It's like, does this film actually have a witch in it? Or is it just Thomasin snapping and imagining that the goat is Satan and imagining that she's been recruited to a coven to justify that she's basically cracked and killed most of her family with the help of a goat? Yeah,
the goat, I did find it quite creepy. And certainly there's a bit when the goat sort of kills the father and then it sort of rears up in a slightly sort of more human way than you'd expect a goat to move. And I found things like that, those moments of kind of when it broke from the kind of tension into straight horror, I did find it quite creepy. However, after a while, the kind of the scary nature of a goat did become a little bit silly. There were definitely people laughing in the cinema around us when there were lines like, "Did you form an unholy union in that barn with that goat?"
I can't imagine why. But
which the problem is, that's the sort of thing, the whole film is written in period dialogue, and there's a thing at the end saying it's based on actual accounts and actual sort of speeches from the time. But there is a degree which is you are inviting people to suspend their disbelief, and I think at that point the audience's disbelief had kind of been stretched a bit too far. Even though it is believable that people would, at the time would be arguing over whether a goat was evil and people had kind of made satanic pacts with it in a barn. it's a big jump for us as a modern audience to believe, and I don't think the film had convinced enough of the people around us, which is why they started laughing in what should have been the scariest part of the film.
I don't know, but I've seen some recent trailers and posters for sort of, I think, what seems to be some sort of secondary campaign to try and take advantage of the fact that it's had a bit of a cult success, which is very much focused on the goat. There's a trailer which basically describes all the feelings in the film, all some critical quotes and stuff, and then ends with, "and black fucking Philip." And it's just... I think the goat's not going to become like a cult character, is it? We're not going to get The Witch 2, in which a goat turns up next to another family.
I really hope not.
Because, yeah, it is creepy in its way. Entirely personally, I find farm animals objectively hilarious. I don't really know why. I just find their mundanity entertaining. So maybe I was never going to be an easy mark for take this satanic goat seriously.
It is a bit of a stretch, whatever your opinion of farm animals. It does, it does stretch the premise somewhat.
RV vis-a-vis goats, yeah.
What I liked about The Witch is that it was trying to do something different, and I am tired of lazy horror movies that kind of just pull you in one way. Before The Witch, there was a trailer for The Conjuring 2, and there was a bit in the trailer, and I was basically like, this is horror by numbers. There's going to be creepy, then there's going to be something that's going to jump out, and the score is going to have a huge kind of bang and crash on it. And it makes you jump, but then it makes you feel kind of, just basically just been taken advantage of. And what I liked about The Witch is that it tried to do something different. It tried to sustain this kind of tension. And it did remind me of some of the horror movies that I really liked from, seeing things I've seen in the past, like Don't Look Now is my favourite horror movie. And I think that does a really good job of sustaining a kind of a creepy tension throughout, only at the end going into actual shock horror.
Yeah, I don't know. I think ultimately it was the sense of disappointment I felt is because, I guess, the two previous appearances of a witch or witch-like thingy, the one at the very start and there's a bit in a barn later on, genuinely freaks me the fuck out. As I say, I was properly perturbed by that. I thought it was a really scary image, really well done. And, I don't know, as a result, I maybe keyed myself up a bit too much for, okay, the possible slight supernatural reveal at the end of the film is going to be properly horrible. And instead it was just a goat in the shadow of a hand, and I was just a bit disappointed. If they were going to show the supernatural on screen, even if they also implied it was entirely in her head, then they could have made it scarier, but never mind. Okay, and next, the incredibly successful podcast Serial, the podcast that is credited for driving the current mass podcast popularity thing that seems to be happening, which we're very much hoping to be part of. But yeah, the second season of that, after the first season investigated a murder mystery in suburbia, the second season pivoted and investigated a soldier going AWOL from his barracks in the Middle East and ending up getting abducted by the Taliban. And his release had to be negotiated, and there was some questions about why he wandered off and whether he was right to wander off. And yeah, it went very heavily into the intricacies of the military and the mindset of the military and how people reacted to it. So yeah, it's finished a couple of weeks ago, he says, trying to remember exactly when this is going out. Now that the whole thing is over and done with, Alastair, what did you think of it?
Well, I liked the second series of Serial. It's generally the reaction, I think, of sort of people I follow on Twitter is that they haven't enjoyed it as much as the first series. I think that's partly because the first series of Serial was a huge viral hit and was something really that captured the imagination of the time once it was started in late 2014. And I think you are unlikely to repeat that with a second series. However good it is, it would never have that freshness of that kind of the appeal of the first series. I liked the second series a lot because I'm interested in the military, I'm interested in military history, I'm interested in the war in Afghanistan. I can see why some other people would not have liked it as much because the first one deals with a murder in suburban Baltimore. I can see how that there's that kind of flavour of the everyday to it that anyone can relate to, whereas people find it harder to relate to what happens to soldiers and what goes on in war because most people, or at least most people, don't have a direct connection to soldiers. I mean, there are obviously lots of people in the military and lots of people served in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, but Bo Border...
Hard name to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I'm going to fall over that a lot. I can't believe Sarah Koenig got it right so many times.
I bet she did this as well.
Yeah, we're finding out what it's like now.
Yeah, exactly. We're living the Serial dream.
The experiences of Bo Bergdahl are more abnormal. Certainly very few people are captured by the Taliban. I think he's the longest American POW to be held by the Taliban. He was held by them for 4 years. So I liked it. But I do feel that also, as well as being a bit harder to relate to than Adnan Syed, the sort of protagonist or focus of the first series, I did feel that the second series didn't have the same degree of ambiguity as the first series. The first series is mainly told sort of kind of Adnan's side of the story. That's partly because the woman he was alleged to have murdered, her family didn't cooperate with Serial, so her story isn't really in it, and for obvious reasons, which does make it a kind of a one-sided thing. And in the second series, they do get a lot of people from the military to talk to Serial, so there is more of both sides. But I felt that in the first series, it was very hard to work out the truth. There was so much evidence about the murder, so many things that pointed in different directions, so many things that contradicted each other, that the appeal of it was kind of navigating this kind of sea of uncertainty and this sea of complexity. Whereas I felt the second series was much more clear-cut.
Yeah, when it first started, there was... I don't know whether this was them intentionally trying to sort of throw us in one direction before pulling us in another. There was a couple of episodes where it seemed like they were going to paint Bo Bergdahl as this sort of conscientious objector, maybe. This sort of guy who agrees with people that the war shouldn't be happening or that the war was being fought wrong, and who decided to goddamn get up and do something about it.
That was certainly implied early on, yes.
It was implied early on, and then it was sort of later hinted that, yes, although he may have had those feelings, he was probably not suited to being out there in the military, and, you know, even if you agree with his stated reasons for doing what he did, he put a lot of people at risk by doing it and probably shouldn't have.
Yeah.
I don't know, I got more into it in the last few weeks, when, to be honest, when it stopped being as much about Bo Bergdahl. There was, the first half to a bit over half of the series, it was quite focused on the military, and there was a lot of military jargon and talking to soldiers about the different stuff involved in Bo Bergdahl's exact actions and his exact circumstances. And then in the last 3 or 4 episodes, they went to him coming home and arranging his rescue and the sort of White House politicking of it all.
Yeah.
Which, that did interest me more. I don't know if that's something that's generally more relatable or just something that interests me personally more. But when it started being about, you know, how the White House handled it and how they were arranging the diplomacy, on the one hand, if you believe that the idea of Serial is to have a mystery, which, to be honest, I don't think they would say it is if they were here for us to ask. I genuinely don't think that's what they want to be doing. But if you were to state that I think the purpose of Serial is to explore a mystery, then I guess it wasn't much of a mystery. It was just a bit of behind-the-scenes White House gossip.
Yeah, I think you're right that in the early part there is a lot of VOBs and CENTCOMs and MRACs and various kind of, you know, military jargon, and then it does get more interesting when they broaden it out into the wider picture, like how does this relate to the struggle against the Taliban in Afghanistan? How does it relate to America's wider foreign policy objectives? How does it relate to the war on terror as a whole? You know, they had to trade 4 detainees from Guantanamo Bay to the Taliban in order to secure Bo Bergdahl's release, or at least that's what's alleged by Serial. And yeah, those kind of big elements are interesting, and you're right that it did get more interesting when it went into that. You know, it was interesting to find out about Bo's background and what led him to being in the military. But I do think that, you know, the fact that he got sort of medical discharge from the Coast Guard meant that he wasn't suited to be in the military. And the only reason why he was allowed into the military is that there was a surge in Afghanistan, they needed more troops, and the normal standard for allowing troops in was laxed. Even as someone who is certainly sceptical about certainly American and British foreign policy since September the 11th, and someone who believes that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq were mistakes and were certainly badly managed, I still think that those soldiers do have a duty to each other that Bo Bergdahl didn't live up to, and by walking off base, he did let his comrades down. I do believe, though, that I guess 4 years in a Taliban prison is probably punishment enough, and Serial goes into detail over that question. You know, it's something, if anyone wants to make up their mind, they should listen to the large amount of evidence they lay out, all the various things that happened connected to his case, how it affected the wider course of the war in Afghanistan. But yeah, so in that sense, there was ambiguity over the morality behind it. I guess it didn't have that kind of, that thing that kind of grabbed and drew you in that the first series had, which was that sense of there's a murder, who did it? We've got a narrow list of suspects, but there's a lot of conflicting pieces of information.
Got to assume that since they went in and did something so entirely the opposite direction, they're very much not interested in being the real-life murder mystery podcast.
Yeah, and I guess assume they were worried they get sort of typecast at that. If they did another murder for the second series, then they would probably... people think that's the thing they did. And again, it's good that they tried something different. They told a whole different story. I like the fact that, similar to the first series, it mainly focuses on one person's experience. But part of what they do is they that one person tells their story. In the first series, it's through phone calls from the prison to Sarah Koenig, who is the producer and the voice of Serial. In the second series, it's a series of recordings that Bo Bergdahl has made with a different journalist and filmmaker whose name temporarily escapes me. But in both series, they have an interesting thing, which is the main person tells their story, but then the listener is invited to question that story, to question whether you believe them, whether they're telling the truth. And Sarah Koenig and the Serial team provide evidence either way, evidence in support of what he says, evidence against their own opinions. They bring in other people's opinions. You're looking at this one person's story, but you're constantly invited to question it, to ask what's real, what's evidence, what's important. And they kept that up, which I thought was very good.
But in terms of the style of it, I think, maybe I'm imagining it, but they didn't seem to focus it quite as heavily on Sarah Koenig is telling you a story. She didn't seem to be quite as personally in there.
Yeah, that did change, partly because the interviews of Adnan Syed in Series 1 are Sarah talking to him directly.
Yeah. Sarah
doesn't speak to Bo Bergdahl, I think, at all in Series 2. It's all based on tapes he's recorded with another journalist. So I guess in that sense, there's that disconnect. She didn't speak to him directly. She speaks to this other journalist. She speaks to other people involved in the story, but she doesn't speak directly to Bo.
So do you think that's a consequence of that, or do you think that's... Because I know that's a reaction to some of the reviews of the first series, because I know there was some criticism of sort of the slightly chummy, let's you and me solve this murder tone that the first season sometimes took on. There was a fairly ridiculous bit where she goes to try and interview some bloke at home and records herself walking up to his door and getting told to piss off or something. Yeah. Stuff like that. There was very little of that in Serial Season 2.
I guess in the first series they were finding their feet a bit. They were doing something new, and that's a very kind of documentary approach. We want to talk to someone, so we'll film like the bit before and the bit after. It's the sort of thing that Nick Broomfield or Louis Theroux would do. So I guess they were finding out what works in a podcast format, what doesn't, maybe borrow some ideas from TV journalism, things like that didn't work out. And also, I think the Bo story became big in the sense that it brings in all these wider questions. The Adnan Syed story, although obviously it's very important because someone did lose their life and there's questions over whether justice has been served. It is still basically mainly involves a small group of people in a small town. I doubt it was the only murder in Baltimore alone that year. Whereas Bo Bergdahl's story is bigger than Bo. It affected the course of the war in Afghanistan. It's affected American foreign policy. It's affecting now the US presidential election because Trump's, making outspoken statements on Bo Bergdahl. So I guess in the sense that Bo's story is bigger than himself, it's about the entire military and it's about the whole war in Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, the Bo Bergdahl story involves, her having to interact with these massive institutions. She can't record herself going up and knocking on the door of the White House because, I don't know, she'd probably get tased or something. So, yeah, I guess she's had no choice but to take on this slightly more conventional, I'm a reporter talking about the facts I've got from my statements about these big institutions tone, rather than the sort of the chatty, I'm going to go to this small town and try and dig up this murder approach of Season 1.
Yeah, and also they had to talk to a wider range of people. I mean, they have a recurring cast, like the members of Bo's platoon, some of his commanding officers, people that knew him before he joined the military, sort of family and close friends. But they do have to talk to a wider range of people. They need to talk to diplomacy experts. They need to talk to military experts. They need to talk to senior military officers. And also just bringing these big questions like Bo's reasons for leaving his platoon and walking off base, which led to him being captured, was not because he objected to the war itself, but because he objected to the way it was being conducted and the American military's approach. And obviously, so in order to tell Bo's story, they have to talk about how was America pursuing the war in Afghanistan, what were the approaches, what was the strategies, what were the things that Bo objected to. So, you can't tell Bo's story without really telling the story of the war in Afghanistan.
No, I mean, I did enjoy it. As I say, I got a lot more into it at the end. At the beginning, I would admit, there was a point towards the middle of the series where I was a bit sort of, I'm just listening to this because I listen to it and because I have a certain amount of time when I tend to listen to podcasts. But towards the last few episodes, I was actually getting quite into, it's Serial time again, like I was in Season 1. It was good.
I think one thing that affected the pacing of this series is that they stopped being week by week and went to bi-weekly, although they did occasionally go back to 2 episodes in 1 week at one point. And I think that was partly because, as the story evolved as they were making it, their coverage changed the story as it brought, wider attention, partly because the first series wasn't very well known and it became a viral hit. The second series, because it was well known, whatever Serial decides to shine a light on becomes international news. So this brought other people forward, people with new evidence, people with different opinions, which then changed the story, which meant they had to rework the story, which meant they couldn't keep to their weekly release schedule. All of which I understand. They made an amazing product, and I like the fact that they decided we're going to take the time to do it properly rather than rush and not do it well. But the flip side of that is that there was a loss of momentum when they went from, it's something you wait for 13 episodes a year, and then when they go from a weekly format to a bi-weekly format, there will be a loss of that kind of sustained storytelling element that is kind of the heart of Serial.
They went across Christmas as well, didn't they?
Yeah, it started later.
Struck me as a really weird decision. Like, again, because they're so big on this is a serial, why would you start it at a point where you know you're going to have to take a protracted break?
Yeah.
Maybe they had a contract or just a firm belief that they should get episodes out before the end of 2015, but there's a part of me that thinks they could have started in 2016 and run it straight through and it would probably have been better. But
I think because it started kind of late autumn in 2014 and ran up to just before Christmas, and then this year it started later and ran later. I can imagine, although I have no evidence for this, it's because the amount of work that was involved in this much more complex story took them longer to be ready. I know they had a very successful Kickstarter during the first series. I don't know if because of that, they felt obliged to deliver something, within a year of the Kickstarter.
Yeah, probably. As I say, if I were them, I'd have just stalled it till January to keep up the serialisation. But as you say, I'm sure that there may well be behind-the-scenes reasons or just plain principle that made them feel they had to.
Yeah, but it was good, and I did like the fact they took the place to deliver a really polished and well-made product. Serial, it's weird. You listen to it, and it sounds just like Sarah Koenig talking and a couple of other people talking, but then it's so well put together how it goes from something she says to something someone else says, how her questions become interviews and the interviews become questions, and it's really entertaining, really well done. The music's great, and then you get to the end credits and you see there's like 30 people who work on Serial. It's it's a hugely intensive process to make something that's that good.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can respect them taking this we're not gonna, get complacent or feed off that success and just do another similar murder. Yeah, you can respect them going, right, no, we're gonna do something different, even if it means we don't necessarily recapture the success of season 1, just because it's not a murder, so it's not as instantly viscerally appealing.
Yeah, I don't think it's a strategy for long-term success to just repeat the same thing over and over, because I don't think they could find a murder that would be as interesting as the first series. And also, if they did another murder again, they'd be following up on Making a Murderer, which took a similar sort of concept to the first series of Serial and kind of did it in a Netflix visual format. So whereas, Serial did something different this year.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's a compromise somewhere. I'm sure they could go, right, we're gonna get another very grounded, suburbs-based or real-life-based crime that the people can really relate to. I guess it doesn't have to be murder. But yeah, or they might stick to their guns and do something even more removed from society. I don't know. Can't be that many more missing soldiers to look for, really.
I think, it'd be a bit of a climb down after Bo Bergdahl being the longest soldier held in captivity. Next up, we're going to be discussing Her Story, a game that won 3 awards at the BAFTA Video Game Awards this year. It won an award for Game Innovation, it won Best Mobile and Handheld Game, and it won Best Debut Game. It also appeared on a lot of Game Critics' Best Games of 2015. I think it's a fascinating concept for a game, and I really enjoyed playing it. Nick, what were your thoughts?
I think it's weird that it lost Best British Game to Batman, the most British concept in the world. That aside, Her Story is a game that revolves around a series of short video clips which are being stored in obviously an imaginary police archive, which you can search through using a basic keyword search. And the idea is that they all relate to this single case, and you have to try and piece together what happened by entering keywords and then viewing the videos that come up. So yeah, the idea is you're watching 5 or 6 different interviews with a woman, and they've all been cut up into bits, and I think there's about an hour and a half of footage in it in total, which have cut up into chunks. Some are a couple of minutes, but a lot are like a couple of seconds, or just her saying yes or no. Because the idea is that all the bits where the off-screen detective asks her a question have been cut out, so all you hear are her answers. You never see or hear the questioner. The only on-screen actor in this whole game is this one woman talking to the camera. And yeah, the idea is you type in keywords and you uncover what happened in this quite complicated murder that's happened. And yeah, it's really good. It's not a video game in the sense of, obviously it doesn't revolve around hand-to-eye coordination, but it is genuinely a really, really great way of evoking the idea of being a detective in a video game, because obviously in a more conventional video game setting, setting, it's often quite hard to evoke the sense of being a detective or piecing things together, because if you're just clicking on items in a room or whatever, you can ultimately just click everywhere, or click all the actions and then click everywhere, and eventually you'll work it out through trial and error. But because in her story, firstly, you have to actually think of keywords to enter, and secondly, because you're not trying to just access the next room, the prize, such as it is basically understanding the case. There's not really any victory beyond that. I mean, you get a little end sequence, which I won't spoil yet. I think we'll probably, again, sequester spoilers off into a private camp towards the end of the review. But yeah, there's not a dramatic reward or further gameplay. Once you've pieced together the murder, that's what you've achieved. You've pieced together the murder, and you get the pride of having successfully worked out what to type in to get the correct clips. So yeah, I think it's a really, really good, interesting mechanic. It's done really, really well. And yeah, I really enjoyed it.
It does some interesting things with narrative, which is one of the things I really liked it. What you see is a fragmented story, and because the story told through these tiny video clips, which you piece together in the order by which you discover them, because the story is structured like that, that means everyone experiences the story differently. So what I saw would have been different from what you saw and for what everyone else who played the game saw. Thus meaning that we all have a subtly different interpretation of the story. I mean, there's the same core facts and the same sort of events that you uncover if you dig through all the video clips, but everyone has you see things in different order, you get a different sense of what's important, you get a different sense of right and wrong. So it really creates a personal experience for you. And you can play through the game different ways and experience it in different ways as well, which is great. I also like the fact that you're right, it's very immersive. The things that video games can do really well is really put you inside a character and make you feel what it's like to be that character. And in this case, it's quite simply someone who is, because the game is set present day, but this person's looking back at a case from the kind of the early 90s or mid 90s. So, you're in the head of this person who's trying to piece together an event kind of 20 years after it happened. And it really puts you in this, and because you're seeing the fragmented story that the character's trying to solve in the way that you solve it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird in a way talking about spoilers for this game, because if you type in the right word or bash your head against the keyboard and hit the right letters, you could get one of the clips that basically tells you the pivotal plot points almost immediately. There could but not really be that much mystery.
It's they're spread out through several different plot points, so you could hit the core ones quite early on. But I think even if you got the ones that say specifically how the person died, you would still really understand the story, because you need all the context around it.
I think one of the things it really succeeds in is there were, when I was playing this, more than one occasion where I thought, I've cracked it, I'm a smug detective, and then I typed in a few more words and watched a few more clips and what? That doesn't match my theory, or that opens up a new direction.
Yeah, it's a very accessible game, which I like the fact it doesn't require hand-eye coordination, doesn't require quick reflexes, doesn't require even particularly puzzle-solving skills. It plays off a skill. The only skill in it is basically searching, search engine searching, which is something most of the people in the world are skilled in, because we've been kind of raised on it or had to acquire those skills. Pretty much everyone in the world has. So it plays off skills we already have as the only sort of challenging element to it. It's also accessible because I've heard a lot of people talk about these AAA games that get made can be very alienating to a lot of people because they're made for quite a narrow section of society. In other words, usually kind of adolescent men or sort of young men who are interested in sort of science fiction and military-based stories and fantasies, which is what a lot of, AAA games are. Or they play off established franchises. As we just said, one of the top prizes at the BAFTAs this year was taken by a Batman game.
But at the same time, I mean, it's not mainstream. I mean, maybe it's not mainstream for gaming, but, it's this murder mystery, this sort of quite convoluted murder mystery is the sort of thing you could see on every week in the latest episodes of about 12,000 procedural crime dramas. I mean, especially because everyone in this has a British accent, because it's a British game, hence its eligibility to be defeated by Batman. It felt like it could be, a sort of 9pm BBC drama. All you need is a few sort of character actors playing the detectives, and you've probably got a readable episode of New Tricks or something.
It's definitely that tradition of British crime drama, suburban sort of, murder, normal life, punctuated by an act of horrific violence is the sort of thing that, British storytellers seem to do very well.
I guess that's why it's the sort of game that academies want to award and people want to talk up, because it's both interesting and innovative in the games field, and it's the sort of thing that can easily go wider. I mean, the fact that it's available on tablets for $2.99 or $3.99 or something. And, it works really well with the tablet interface because it is just typing words into a box and then tapping videos to play them. So yeah, it's, very now, I guess.
It's a great game for commuting, which is how I played it. I installed it on my tablet and played it on my commute, because everything is just these short film clips. Some are only like 5, 6, 7 seconds. Some are up to about 2-3 minutes. I don't think I found any that were longer than like 2 or 3 minutes. So you could get a lot of like sort of fragments in one commute, and then you would kind of, then have to go to work, and you'd be sitting at your desk all day and you'd be thinking through the bits you've heard, thinking through the evidence, trying to work out what was important, and then on the way home you'd kind of try and uncover a bit more. And what I did really like about the game is that kind of going through, listening to what the woman said and trying to think like kind of what's important in here, what words can I pull out from what she's saying that I can then search for and that will uncover more of the story. I mean, I really started to make breakthroughs when I realised that you could combine terms. I could put characters' names together. I could put, a kind of like character and body into a search, and then I'd get something interesting, which again is playing off the skills I've built up growing up on the internet and learning, how to search for things.
It also used the clever limitation of only giving you the top 5 results, or the first 5 results anyway, which forces you to be a bit more specific, because I think it arranges them chronologically, doesn't it? With the understanding that therefore you won't always get the last ones.
Yeah, you have to dig deeper to get the later stuff. Were you able to look at every single video clip?
No, I don't think so. I think I watched a fair percentage of them in the end.
I think I watched about 2/3. It took me a while to discover that, because you're watching these videos in a sort of desktop window on a simulated computer. It took me a while to realise that you could click the other icons outside the window and they did things.
Yeah.
And there's one that's a bit, if you move the window that you're viewing the videos in, there's one that's obscured behind it, and that brings up a kind of map of the database, which it has kind of green squares on it, and the squares turn red, I think, as you watch them. So, and I think from that I was able to judge that I'd seen about 2/3.
This is probably getting into spoilers again, but did you get the chat window coming up then? You got the ending?
Yeah, I got the chat window. Again, if you really want to play Her Story, and I recommend that you do, and you don't want to know what the mystery behind it all is, skip forward a few minutes, because we're going to go into some spoilers now. So I think I managed to piece together, from watching about 2/3 of all the video clips, pretty much everything that had happened. The events surrounding the murder. I managed to work out that there were 2 women, not one. They were twins, Hannah and Eve. I managed to work out that they kind of both had one was married to the victim, Simon. They both had affairs with him at various points. Despite,
as I say, the sort of British groundingness of it, it's just a woman talking in very standard conversational English parlance to a camera in quite a drab room. But it is in a way, it's quite a sort of mythical or fairy tale inspired story, isn't it? The idea of this secret twin who has to live in an attic.
Yeah.
There are a lot of bits, I don't know if you saw them, but there's a few bits at least, where they talk about the Book of Fairy Tales and how fascinated they were by it.
Yeah, I got those clips. And also talk about the doll's house and things like that. Yeah, the beautiful old doll's house, and playing, stories of Rapunzel and, princess stories and stuff. So yeah, they did weave this kind of fantasy sort of element into it.
It's not a fantasy element, but it's because they're very careful to make it practical. There's a lot of stuff talking about exactly how they did the sort of sharing lives thing, but there's something very ethereal about it. It is, if you did want to get into like story critique, it's honestly, even by OTT crime drama standards, it's a bit far-fetched. But I think because they press gently at this sort of larger-than-life fairy tale thing, I think that sort of provides you with enough tug to make it work, I think.
The issue is that in order to make it work, there has to be a large number of video clips. If there's only a small number of video clips, you'll get through them all quite quickly, and there won't really be much grounds for weaving a different path through the story. And in order for them to be a large number of video clips, the story of this murder must be complex to a degree, which therefore means it must be more complex than the average life and the average story. And it has to be a complexity surrounding, one person or 2 people, as the twist is. That, I think, inevitably will lead to the story being possibly a bit far-fetched, because it has to be complex to serve the needs of the medium. And I think they did as good a job possible of the kind of slightly far-fetchedness of it, kind of because of the way you experience the story in such a fragmented way, because everyone experiences it differently. The complexity of the story and the far-fetched played into that. I've found a clip when they were talking, I think Hannah was talking about Eve, and I suddenly realised, and I have this penny drop moment, I've been talking to 2 people. So the first thing I searched was twins, and the clip that I got that came up was one of them denying that there were any twins at all and saying there's only one person. So then I was like, wait a minute, am I wrong? Am I right? How do I know what I'm seeing is truth? How do I know who's telling the truth if there are 2 people?
It depends what crime drama you're comparing it to. I mean, it might be a bit far-fetched for new tricks like I said earlier, but on the other hand, I'm pretty sure I've seen episodes of Jonathan Creek that are sillier than this.
Yeah, Jonathan Creek's is a good one because, that's something, it will show you something you think is fairly straightforward, and then it turns out there's more complexity behind it, there's more to it than you thought, which is something that her story does very well. It starts with quite a straightforward story. A man's been killed, you don't know who did it, the only person you're talking to doesn't know who did it, but then you kind of uncover there's more to her than you expected.
Yeah, there are some. I did a bit of reading around the game after I decided I'd finished watching the clip, so there is a lot of fan theorising around. There's a lot of thinking about, whether there's even more to it than is outlined in the clips, like whether Eve's basically a serial killer who offed both her foster mother and her real parents, and possibly even Hannah at the end.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because Hannah's parents die at one point.
Hannah's parents die in slightly odd circumstances. And yeah, I think there's also some discussion about how it's not Hannah most of the time, and then Eve in the last couple. They actually swap in and out. I think one of them likes tea and the other one likes coffee, and you can therefore tell by what drink they order at the start of the sequence or something. But the guy who was primarily responsible for it has said there might be a sequel, but it'll be more a follow-up than a sequel. Might just be another similar-ish game using a similar mechanic rather than an actual plot sequel, because obviously I don't think revisiting her story is going to be particularly helpful to anyone.
Now that we know what's going to happen, I can't imagine there's sort of more meat to be gotten from that story. What I like about this is it's not like, because there are plenty of games like Mass Effect, for example, where your decisions throughout Mass Effect influence the story to a greater or lesser degree. And there are lots of games, when you're kind of like, if you can save this person, or you can go here first and you can do this, and it changes what happens later.
Yeah, there's a part of me that sort of thought, well, would it have been nice if they'd somehow locked off the final interview recording that lays out most of what's the apparent storyline is, so that you have to unlock a certain amount of other stuff before you could read that one or something, just to, force at least some amount of experience on you. But I guess, they've decided to go for the all or nothing approach, and fair enough.
I can't remember what I actually had to type in order to bring up the clips that had the kind of the solution to it. But it was through experience, other things. It was something I don't think I would have been able to type in. Most of what I did is I listened to each clip, and if a name came up, I searched for that name and listened to everything around that person. And that's how I was able to build up a sort of a picture of the various characters, specifically Hannah and Eve. I also uncovered a lot by just typing random words in. Like, I just typed in, like, fuck and shit and stuff, just to see. And
I did that as well, because that's just what people do.
He was great. I think we said something profound about humanity. We're given a device to search that contains an enormous wealth of information, and we just type in swear words.
I was going to go for the more profound, that's what people do, they fucking shit, but fair point.
Yeah, that was one approach, just uncovering information, and actually it returned a lot of useful information.
Yeah, I was going to say, the fucking shit searches did not fail me. It was... I got a lot out of that fuck and that shit, it was good.
I'm glad you had a good fuck and a good shit.
Let's move on. Okay, lastly for this episode, our regular and actually still unnamed recommendations feature. Last week, I recommended to Alastair that he read some Punisher comics by Garth Ennis, since he so enjoyed the Punisher in the Daredevil series. And the ones I picked were from his Run on the Max series, that's Marvel's adult targeted line. And there was a book called Born, which focused on the Punisher's time in the Vietnam War, and that was illustrated by Derek Robertson. And then there was another book called From First to Last, which collected 3 stories set throughout his career. One at the beginning, the middle and the end, and these were drawn by Louis LaRosa, John Severin and Richard Corbin. And yes, I thought they were an interesting cross-section of how Garth Ennis approaches the Punisher and what he does with him. Alastair, what did you think of them?
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading these, actually. Really interesting stuff. Before watching Daredevil Series 2, I had very little knowledge of the Punisher. I hadn't seen either of the Thomas Jane films that were made. So, I got a sense of the character from Daredevil, which we talked about in the previous episode. But it was really interesting to get a sense of the Punisher as he appears in comics, or at least what Garth Ennis, established comic writers' take on the Punisher was. And yeah, they found him to be a fascinating character. Some really great stories. I found them both really interesting. I read Born first.
Yeah.
Which I think was the right way to go about it, because that's just a story of him in Vietnam before he is the Punisher. So that gave me a lot more background to the character and, sort of the experiences that made him who he is. And you get a sense of his kind of, frontier justice. You get a strong sense of that in the Vietnam stories, how he's fighting for America in Vietnam, but he kills one of his comrades because of their mistreatment of a prisoner of war. He's got a very strong moral code. He's also got, he's kind of quick with the noose or with the gun, so to speak. He believes in settling things the old-fashioned way, I suppose. He's not afraid of violence, so you certainly get that sense. The other thing that Bourne I thought was really interesting about Punisher Bourne was it's part of this kind of wider story of Vietnam stories. Vietnam is such an important part of the American psyche and such an important part of their cultural history and the art that comes out of America. It's in everything from there's some amazing films like The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now. It affects other films of the period that aren't necessarily set in Vietnam, like Taxi Driver. So many great American writers bring in Vietnam to their stories. Tom Clancy did a Vietnam story. I think it was called Without Remorse. And again, this is the kind of the Marvel universe and the Punisher character, again, taking on that idea of where does Vietnam sit in the American psyche? Where do stories about Vietnam sit? What do they mean? And you can spin a story of a man, traumatized by a war who sees acts of extreme violence in what was quite a horrific war, and how that changes him as a person. And then how, following on from that, the death of his family can push him over to the edge to become a vigilante. So I enjoyed reading that, and then I really enjoyed reading From First Till Last. Fascinating stories, really well told. I think I probably preferred... My favourite part of the whole thing was that story, The Tiger, which I think is the first story in From First Till Last.
Yes, the first one, yeah, that is it, yeah.
Which is about the Punisher growing up before he's in Vietnam. And what I liked about that is it also said that even though his experiences in Vietnam formed him as a person, it was also some of his experiences before that, seeing a childhood friend be murdered and then that murderer be burnt alive by the childhood friend's older brother, definitely informed the Punisher's sense of justice and going outside the law to achieve justice. And that was a really interesting story, and it brought in the William Blake poem Tiger, which it takes its name from, and that was fascinating.
Garth Ennis' thesis on the Punisher, I think, it's always been this idea that you could get sidetracked by this idea of he's a man who just happened to have the training, and when his family were killed in front of him, he decided to go for justice. And Garth Ennis came into this in the 2000s with the thesis that no, this man is a serial killer. This man is not stable. I don't care if your family were killed in front of you, you don't then go and do that. Something had to have happened to you before, ideally several somethings, or you just had to have had that in you from an early age.
I can see that, yeah, and I think that's a really interesting take on the character, and certainly what he's done with both these stories of Bourne and specifically the Tiger story and From First to Last is he has laid out what made the Punisher before his family was killed, how his experiences growing up poor in New York with kind of mobsters around him getting away with whatever they want, including the murder of preteens or young children or, children. Yeah. And also, and his experiences of seeing justice outside the law being done to mob people, and also his experiences in Vietnam. And obviously, we do know that a lot of people were traumatized by Vietnam. I mean, to link this back to Serial, I think in the last episode they say that war traumatizes a lot of people. There's a lot of people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan completely traumatized by their military experience. And Vietnam was that on a much larger scale. And certainly that's informed a lot of the culture in America. It's informed a lot of the cultural discussion. And the Punisher is, a part of that. And, it ties into this, wider story of how America comes to terms with Vietnam. And then some people have come to terms with Vietnam violently. I was going to draw up a list of soldiers in Vietnam who got on to become spree killers, but I thought that would be probably there are quite a few, but I think that may have got a bit too dark for this podcast.
Those Punisher stories were a bit bleak, but fair enough.
Certainly they were bleak, and my point is that it takes a very real thing and something a very active and live wire within American culture, and brings it into this kind of idea of an established character, and then uses that to kind of develop that character more, make them believable, give them some substance, which I really liked.
Yeah, and obviously, in Bourne, even when Bourne starts, the idea of a Punisher as this guy addicted to combat, well, Frank Castle as he then is.
Yeah, you get the sense in Bourne that he is, to some degree, addicted to war or addicted to the conflict. He's on his third tour, which is obviously quite a lot, and he's in this sort of, this bastion or outpost that's been sort of slowly dismantled and taken away as America withdraws from Vietnam. And he wants to carry on fighting, and he's kind of pushing people to carry on fighting, even though it's kind of so many other people, including his superior officers, are saying kind of, what's the point? It's over. But he's determined to carry on. In the story of Bourne, though, he speaks to a kind of disembodied voice. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this, so I guess this ties in sort of to what we've said about The Witch and what we've said about her story as well. What was your take on the suggestion of a vague Faustian deal in Bourne?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well, because it's the first time I've seen in something, The Punisher, something that could cross over to be supernatural. I mean, I do know that in some other Marvel stories, the devil, or in some form of devil character, does appear. I mean, I don't know if it was supposed to be Thanos or something.
Well...
I don't know.
The Max stuff, the Marvel comics with the Max stamp on the outside that take place in their sort of mature readers line.
Yeah.
Certainly the Punisher ones by Garth Ennis do generally take place outside of Marvel continuity. There's no cosmic beings or anything. There's no other Marvel guest stars.
There's no crossover with Thor or Iron Man.
Yeah, like in the present day Punisher Max stuff. Garth Ennis wrote a Punisher Max line series for 60 issues, as well as these short stories, and they all take place with us in a sort of real time sense, as in the Punisher is actually in his 50s when the stories take place in like the early 2000s, whereas generally the Marvel Universe Punisher is sort of generic superhero age, sort of 30s, maybe 40s, and I think his origin for necessity has been sort of quietly shifted from Vietnam to generic Middle East conflict.
Same as it is in the current Daredevil TV show.
Yes, exactly. So, whereas the Garth Ennis Max run is, I think, meant to be grounded in this sort of, part of me doesn't want to say realistic, but a plausible, real-time, certainly, basis, with no other Marvel characters. So, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the Devil Dealy stuff in that when it gets really literal towards the end, and sort of, I don't understand, is he talking to a literal dark force, or is he just crazy? And obviously, like with The Witch and like with her story, maybe the ambiguity is part of the fun, but it does get a bit odd when you get to the point where it seems to basically know the future.
Yeah, that is a strange part. I like the fact how Bourne also told the story of the Punisher, also through the eyes of other people around him, his kind of platoon colleagues and the other characters. You kind of saw how they saw him. There was a guy who was very much wanted to go home, but knew that if he kept close to Frank Castle, he would survive the war because Frank Castle was addicted to conflict, but also very good at it, so he wasn't going to get killed. There was another character who was fighting heroin addiction, which was a problem in Vietnam. So you get to see the Punisher, who's a kind of an iconic figure, through the eyes of other people, which is, I think, a good way to view an iconic character.
I think a lot of the Garth Ennis Punisher stuff, particularly when he went to the adult-rated line, does lean quite heavily on viewing the Punisher as this sort of force of nature through the eyes of other people who are mostly a bit scared of him. Because I think, honestly, the psychological journey of the Punisher isn't necessarily that interesting. He's just a bit crazy. Particularly Garth Ennis' take on him is just, this is an incredibly driven serial killer.
Yeah.
So, I think that's the approach that works. So you said your favourite one was the Tiger from First to Last.
I did like that a lot, yeah. And I thought it painted a really rich picture of his background. It brought in a lot of aspects of the time. I mean, his dad works in a dock. I think he's a docker, and he's in a union, and it brings in that, and it's got this kind of very familiar story, but very well done. How he sort of got a crush on a girl in the neighborhood, and they do a after school poetry class with a priest. It's a familiar story, but it's got a real warmth to it.
Yeah, I really like the art actually. I think that one's John Severin. The nice sort of warm, classic storybookiness of it. It was a really lovely story. Lovely in a quite grim way, obviously, but still.
Yeah, and it brought in the literary references to William Blake and the Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, which gives the story its name. That was very good.
The Cell, I quite like The Cell, although it's the one that's Hugh's closest to here's a generic Punisher story, but it's a really well told one. So
yeah, that one also you see the Punisher through the eyes of other characters, mainly the people. In that one, the Punisher gets sent to prison because there's some people in prison he wants to get to. And I like that one as well because it fills in more about his origin, because they were mobsters who were involved in the massacre where Frank Castle's family were killed. So I like how it linked back to his origin story.
Yeah, and the end again, I think, is the most straight up ludicrous assertion of this Punisher as serial killer thesis. When you literally get to the stage of, will the Punisher stop his single-handed murder mission if it means he'll wipe out the human race if he doesn't?
Yeah.
The answer, of course, because Garth Ennis is committed to this, is no, he won't.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Post-apocalyptic Punisher. Pretty much everything in the world's been wiped out by a nuclear war, and there's some criminals in a bunker somewhere, and they're the last people left in the world, so obviously the Punisher must find them and kill them, and then the Punisher is the only person left.
Yeah, it's the idea of the Punisher as a force of nature. Everyone's dead, except the Punisher and the few criminals who he will now walk across the irradiated landscape to shoot.
Yeah.
But yeah... That wasn't actually the end of Garth Ennis' run. It came out a few years before he stopped writing The Punisher, but I thought it was a nice full stop to his general point.
Yeah, I think that book works really well to kind of do before, during, and after story. And they were good, but they were certainly good books to read out of context without having to dive into a big comic story arc. And I would certainly recommend to anyone else like me who enjoyed The Punisher in the recent Netflix Marvel show and wants to dip their toes into more Punisher. This is a good place to start. These stories that are kind of, you could read read them in an evening and it's a self-contained story, and you can really get something out of them. And it was also interesting as someone, new or new-ish to reading comics, in that, I'm learning more about how comics are written and stuff, and how they are very fast-paced and they move through things very quickly. Most things I watch or read move at a slower pace.
There was one specific bit when I was rereading Bourne before I gave it to you to prepare for this conversation. There was a specific bit which I read it when I read it. I remembered reading it for the first time. I remembered I had to go back and reread it to work out exactly what happened. There's a bit with a sign where a general walks past a sign because Frank Castle's standing in front of it.
Yes, I remember that as well. And I also had to reread that because I was reading through it quite quickly, and then, some guy's dead. And I was like, what? Why is he dead? And then I looked back and had to reread it again to see kind of what had been set up that I'd missed because I was reading it quickly.
It's sometimes easy to, when reading comics, to get a bit sucked into just reading the dialogue, but that was a very good bit of sort of paddle-to-paddle visual storytelling.
Yeah, and I did like the how visual these are. I mean, it seems a bit obvious to say. I really enjoyed how visual a comic is, because obviously it's a visual medium, but I liked the pages that when there would be like no words on a page, just pictures, or like one big picture, usually of Frank Castle firing a massive gun, but they were always really beautifully drawn and kind of very provocative images, some very violent images, but very provocative, very well done.
Garth Ennis is great as a writer to give you at this stage, and he's just one of the great pros. He's very good at that sort of storytelling and knowing when to leave the artist to it and so on.
Yeah, and he does a very good job. Yeah, I've really enjoyed reading these comics.
Alright, cool. Well, there may well be more Garth Ennis in your future, but not quite yet, as I believe it's your turn to recommend me something.
Well, next time I thought we'd continue this kind of vein of violent stories, but also kind of violence that lurks under the sort of suburban normality, which is something we've explored in Her Story and in Serial and in The Punisher. I'm going to recommend to you a favourite film of mine. It's a David Lynch film from 1986 called Blue Velvet. It's a crime story, it's a sort of horror story, it's a sort of thriller. It's very tense, it's quite disturbing, it's very strange, it's very David Lynch, is the only way to say, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, I know roughly who David Lynch is, but I've not really known anything about this film, so I'll probably just stay ignorant for now and wait till I see it.
David Lynch makes some very strange films, and I must say this is one of his most accessible. Well, it's a good place to start if you haven't seen any David Lynch films before.
Yep, okay. I look forward to it.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you're interested in more, please subscribe in your podcast feed or wherever you get podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter. We're at MFV podcast. You can also go to our website, which is moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can listen to our previous episodes and our bonus episodes, Excessive Fantasy Violence. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Alastair J.R. Ball. You can also get more of my writing about science fiction on nimbusspace.co.uk and my writing about politics on redtrainblog.blogspot.com.
Okay, and you can follow me on Twitter as at NickMB. You can get more of my writing and talk of my self-published crime books at nickbryan.com. And one last social media point, you can also officially register your like for Moderate Fantasy Violence at facebook.com/moderatefantasyviolence if you so wish. And you could also leave us a review on iTunes, which would be lovely, as it means more people can find the show. And lastly, we need to have a serious talk about the next episode. In 2 weeks from now is the day before Captain America Civil War comes out, but we would quite like to review that film while it's reasonably current and while our reactions are fresh. So basically, the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, episode 6, will be probably 2 or more likely 3 days late while we see Civil War, formulate some amazing opinions on it, and record a review. So yeah, we just thought it'd be good to actually get our opinions in there before they get too jaded or before we become too influenced by the consensus, which will clearly have formed if we wait 2 weeks to podcast. So yeah, we will see you in 2 and a bit weeks, and the good news is there'll then be a slightly smaller gap before episode 7. Okay, I think that is everything we got. So happy birthday to my sister, who I believe's birthday is on the day this episode is meant to come out. I've no idea if she listens, and see you next time. Bye.
Goodbye. Yeah, I'm still there.
Okay, sorry, there was a big pop on Afghanistan. I wasn't sure if you cut out.
I wasn't blown up, fortunately.
It's a shame, really, because based on the success of Serial, if you'd mysteriously died mid-podcast, that would probably get our download stats way up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but though it would kind of curtail the future of the podcast. I don't know how you do episode 6.
Me neither. Okay. Well, then, okay. In that case, since I do all the audio editing, you can go and murder someone. Go on.